Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. I never thought that horror could wear such a mundane face. That terror could emerge from the spaces between the ordinary moments of life. But now I know better. Now I understand that the most frightening things hide in plain sight, waiting for the precise moment when our guard drops. My name is Mia Park. 2 years ago, when I was 14, my life changed forever. I'm sharing this story not to frighten you, but as a warning. Sometimes the monsters aren't hiding under the bed, they're watching from the tree line, plotting their approach. Our home sat on the edge of Pinecrest, a small town nestled against vast stretches of dense woodland in western Oregon. The two-story colonial house had been my family's home since I was 7. With weathered blue siding and white trim, it looked like something from a postcard, picturesque and utterly unremarkable. Behind the house, our manicured lawn gave way to wild underbrush and towering evergreens that seemed to stretch forever. For as long as I could remember, those woods had been our playground. My brothers and I knew every trail, every creek, and every climbing tree within a mile radius. Our parents gave us the freedom to roam, believing that childhood should be filled with fresh air and adventure rather than screens and schedules. My 3 brothers each had their distinct personalities. There was Tanner, 13 at the time, with his endless energy and quick temper. Noah, 14 and my closest sibling in age, was the quietest of us all, observant and thoughtful. Then there was Benjamin, 18 and impatient to leave for college, who saw babysitting his younger siblings as a burden rather than a responsibility. Looking back, I realize how naive we all were. How casually we treated the boundary between our civilized world and the wilderness beyond. The woods weren't just trees and shadows, they were a perfect hiding place. October arrived with a spectacular display of autumn colors. The maples turned fiery red, the birches glowed golden, and the air carried the sweet decay of fallen leaves. My parents had gone to Portland for the weekend, leaving Benjamin in charge. It was Friday afternoon, and the house had that peculiar emptiness that comes when adults are away. I remember every detail of that day with unnatural clarity. The sky was overcast, threatening rain that never quite manifested. I wore my favorite white long-sleeve shirt with the square neckline and dark gray sweatpants. My long hair, mocha brown with natural highlights that appeared in the summer, was tied back in a messy ponytail. Benjamin was upstairs in his room, his voice drifting down through the floorboards as he talked on the phone with his girlfriend, Jenna. He'd been on that call for nearly 2 hours, completely neglecting his supervisory duties. Tanner and Noah had disappeared into their shared bedroom, where the sounds of their video game, gunfire, and explosions provided a constant background noise. I sat alone in the living room, scrolling through social media on my phone, half watching a reality show on the television. The sliding glass door that led to our back deck reflected the room's interior against the darkening forest beyond. As the afternoon faded toward evening, that reflective quality intensified, turning the glass into a mirror that obscured the world outside. It started with a sound so faint I almost missed it. A light tap against the glass, tap, tap, tap. I glanced up, assuming it was a bird confused by its reflection, but saw nothing. Returning to my phone, I dismissed the sound. But then it came again, more insistent, tap, tap, tap. Noah? I called, wondering if my brother was playing a trick. No answer came except the continued sounds of the video game upstairs. The tapping continued at irregular intervals, sometimes stopping long enough that I would almost forget about it, then starting again just as I relaxed. After nearly 20 minutes of this, my irritation overcame my laziness. I put down my phone and approached the glass door. Pressing my face close to the surface, I cupped my hands around my eyes to reduce the glare. The deck was empty. Beyond it, the first row of trees stood like sentinels, their trunks disappearing into shadow as my eyes tried to penetrate deeper into the forest. Nothing. No birds, no squirrels, no explanation for the sound. I was about to turn away when I noticed something odd. One of the shadows didn't quite match the others. It seemed denser somehow, more defined. As I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the shadow moved. Just slightly. Just enough. I stepped back, my heart suddenly racing. The rational part of my brain suggested it was just a deer or perhaps a large raccoon, but something more primitive whispered that whatever lurked at the edge of our property was watching me with purpose. I quickly closed the blinds and retreated to the kitchen, where I busied myself making a snack I no longer had an appetite for. By the time I returned to the living room, I had convinced myself that my imagination had gotten the better of me. The blinds remained closed and I didn't hear the tapping again that night. Over the next few days, I noticed small, unsettling changes around our property. A garden chair moved from one side of the deck to the other. Muddy footprints on the step that weren't there when I left for school. Once I found one of my hair ties, a purple one I thought I'd lost weeks before, placed carefully on the porch railing. I mentioned these oddities to my brothers, but they dismissed my concerns. "You're being paranoid," Benjamin said, barely looking up from his laptop. "Probably just Dad moving stuff around when he's been drinking his morning coffee." My parents were equally dismissive. "The wind could have moved the chair," my mother suggested. "And those footprints are probably just from one of you kids." But I knew something was wrong. I could feel it, a constant prickling at the back of my neck whenever I was alone in the house. The sensation of being observed by unseen eyes. I began to avoid the living room after dark. I kept the blinds closed at all times. I double-checked the locks before bed. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the first tapping incident, I was alone in the house. My parents were at work. Benjamin was at basketball practice, and Tanner and Noah had gone to a friend's house. Rain pattered against the windows, and the wind made the old house creak and settle in ways that suddenly seemed sinister rather than familiar. I was in my bedroom, headphones on, attempting to focus on homework rather than the empty house around me. A particularly loud crack of thunder made me jump, and I removed my headphones, listening to the storm. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the weather or the house. Scritch, 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 like fingernails dragging slowly across the sliding glass door downstairs. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just tree branches being blown against the house. But we'd trimmed those branches back in the summer precisely because they scratched against the windows during storms. Scritch, 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 deliberate, rhythmic, human. My mouth went dry. I reached for my phone with trembling hands, ready to call my parents or even 911. But before I could dial, the scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard the unmistakable sound of the sliding door opening. Someone was in the house. I moved with silent urgency, locking my bedroom door and pushing my desk chair against it for good measure. I retreated to the farthest corner of my room, phone clutched in my hand, and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice was like a lifeline. Someone's broken into my house, I whispered, terrified that my voice would carry downstairs. I'm alone and hiding in my bedroom. I'm sending officers right away, she assured me. Can you stay on the line with me? Yes, I breathed, straining to hear any movement from below. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I listened to footsteps moving through the first floor of our home. Heavy, unhurried steps that explored each room with methodical patience. Then, the worst sound of all, footsteps on the stairs. The dispatcher kept talking to me, telling me to stay calm, that help was almost there. But all I could focus on was the approaching footsteps and the shadow that appeared beneath my door. The doorknob turned slowly, testing the lock. Then came 3 distinct knocks. Not frantic or angry, but patient, almost polite. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall as if I could somehow pass through it and escape. The shadow remained for what felt like an eternity. Then abruptly it disappeared. The footsteps retreated down the hall, down the stairs, and then I heard the sliding door close. 5 minutes later, police sirens wailed in the distance. By the time they arrived, the intruder was gone. The only evidence of their presence was muddy footprints on the carpet and a single Polaroid photograph left on the kitchen counter. The photo showed me at my desk, taken through my bedroom window. Written across the bottom in neat block letters were the words, "Pretty girl watching." The police searched the property and the surrounding woods but found nothing. They increased patrols in our neighborhood and advised us to install a security system. My parents finally took my concerns seriously, and within days cameras were mounted at every entrance, motion sensor lights installed around the perimeter. But technology couldn't erase the violation I felt. Someone had been watching me, possibly for weeks. They had stood outside my window photographing me in private moments. They had walked through our home with casual confidence, and somehow I knew they would be back. Life became a series of precautions. I never went anywhere alone. I constantly scanned my surroundings for anything unusual. I slept with my bedroom door locked and a baseball bat beside my bed. Despite the security cameras and increased police presence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being observed. Then came the incident that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late October. My parents had driven to Seattle for an overnight business trip, leaving Benjamin in charge once again. Unlike before, however, he was taking his responsibilities more seriously in light of the break-in. The day had been unnervingly normal. School, homework, dinner prepared by Benjamin. Burnt mac and cheese, but we ate it anyway. By early evening, the four of us had settled into our usual positions. Tanner and Noah playing video games, Benjamin texting friends, and me in the living room, half-heartedly watching a documentary. The security system had given us a false sense of safety. The cameras were visible deterrents, we reasoned. No one would be stupid enough to approach the house now. We were wrong. At precisely 6:43 p.m., I remember checking the time on my phone. The power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the security system's backup battery emitted a series of warning beeps before falling silent. "Just great," Benjamin muttered from the kitchen. "Everyone stay put. I'll check the breaker box." "Should we call someone?" I asked, already reaching for my phone. "It's probably just the storm," he replied, though the night was clear and still. "Give me 2 minutes." He disappeared into the garage with a flashlight. Tanner and Noah had emerged from their room, and we gathered in the living room, our faces illuminated by the blue glow of our phone screens. "The Wi-Fi's out too," Noah noted, refreshing his screen repeatedly. "And there's no cell service," Tanner added, holding his phone up as if searching for a signal. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. This was methodical. The sliding door leading to the deck was covered by blinds, but a sliver of outside visibility remained where they didn't quite meet the floor. It was through this narrow gap that I saw it, a pinpoint of light moving across the yard, approaching the house. "Someone's outside," I whispered, pointing. We huddled together, watching the light weave between trees. It disappeared momentarily, then reappeared much closer to the house. "Where's Ben?" Tanner asked, his voice uncharacteristically small. "He should have been back by now," I agreed. Noah moved to the front window, peering through the curtains. "I don't see anyone out front. Should we?" His words were cut short by a sharp, sudden knock at the sliding door. 3 precise raps that seemed to reverberate through the silent house. We froze, staring at the door. Through the gap beneath the blinds, I could see a pair of boots standing on our deck. "Don't answer it," I whispered, grabbing Tanner's arm as he instinctively moved toward the door. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. And then, horrifyingly, the handle of the sliding door began to move. We had locked it. I was certain we had locked it, but the handle continued to turn, and the door began to slide open. Just an inch at first, then wider, until a rush of cool night air swept into the room. The blinds were still drawn, creating a bizarre tableau where we could see only the intruder's feet and lower legs as they stepped into our home. "Benjamin?" Noah called out, his voice breaking.
"Is that you?"
The figure stopped. Slowly, a hand appeared at the edge of the blinds, fingers curling around the plastic slats. With deliberate precision, the blinds were pulled aside, revealing our visitor in full. It was a tall, lean figure dressed in a black hoodie and blue jeans. But it was the face, or rather the lack of one, that turned my blood to ice. A white mask covered their features, with crude black lines forming a simplistic smiling face. We screamed then, all 3 of us, scrambling backward toward the hallway. The figure remained motionless for a moment, head tilted slightly as if curious about our reaction. Then with startling speed, they lunged forward. I don't remember making a conscious decision to run. My body simply reacted, primal survival instincts taking control. I pushed Tanner and Noah ahead of me toward the front door, but the masked figure was faster. They cut across the living room, blocking our escape route. Upstairs, I shouted, changing direction. Go! We raced toward the staircase, the masked intruder close behind. I felt fingers brush against my hair, trying to grab it, and I ducked instinctively. We reached the stairs and began to climb, but I knew we were cornering ourselves. Where was Benjamin? Had the intruder already found him? We reached the second-floor landing, gasping for breath. My room, I managed to say. The lock. Before we could move, a deafening boom echoed through the house. The masked figure halfway up the stairs stumbled backward. Benjamin stood at the bottom of the staircase, our father's shotgun raised to his shoulder. Get away from my family, he growled, racking another shell into the chamber. The masked intruder clutched their shoulder, dark liquid seeping between their fingers. For a terrible moment, they remained still, the painted smile on their mask creating a grotesque contrast to the violence of the scene. Then, with unexpected agility for someone who'd just been shot, they vaulted over the stair railing and sprinted toward the open sliding door. Benjamin fired again but missed as the figure disappeared into the darkness beyond our deck. Are you guys okay? Benjamin asked, rushing up the stairs to check on us. He was pale, his hand shaking as he lowered the shotgun. What happened to you? I demanded. Someone jumped me in the garage, he explained, showing us a nasty gash on the back of his head. I woke up a few minutes ago. When I heard screaming, I grabbed Dad's gun from the safe. We huddled together in the upstairs hallway, frightened beyond words. Benjamin tried calling 911, but as we'd discovered earlier, there was no service. The landline was dead too. We need to get out of here, he decided, checking the shotgun's ammunition. They might come back, and they might not be alone. We crept downstairs, Benjamin leading the way with the shotgun at the ready. The front door was our best option, away from the woods where the intruder had disappeared. We moved as silently as possible, jumping at every creak and shadow. Just as we reached the front door, the lights suddenly came back on. The security system rebooted with a series of beeps, and our phones simultaneously chimed with incoming notifications. We stood frozen, blinking in the sudden brightness, unsure what to make of this development. Had the intruder deliberately restored what they had disabled? Was it a trap? Benjamin made the decision for us. We're still leaving, he said firmly. We'll go to the Hendersons' house and call the police from there. We piled into Benjamin's car, looking back at our brightly lit home as he backed down the driveway. It looked so normal, so safe, but we knew the truth. Our sanctuary had been violated and nothing would ever feel secure again. The police response was substantial this time. Squad cars, crime scene investigators, and even K-9 units swarmed our property. They found evidence of the intruder's presence. Blood on the stairs where Benjamin had shot them. Footprints throughout the house and yard, and the cut telephone and internet lines. The power outage, we learned, had been caused by someone tampering with our circuit breaker, not by damaging the main power supply. This suggested an unsettling familiarity with our home's layout. Most disturbing of all were the discoveries made in the woods behind our house. A small campsite had been established about a quarter-mile into the forest, hidden among dense underbrush. The site contained food wrappers, a sleeping bag, and a tree where dozens of photographs had been pinned to the bark. All of the photos were of me. Some were taken from a distance, me walking to school, sitting on the front porch, or talking with friends at the local cafe. Others were more intimate, shot through windows, me doing homework at my desk, sleeping in my bed, changing clothes. The campsite yielded few forensic clues. The intruder had been careful, leaving no fingerprints or DNA evidence other than the blood on our staircase. That blood was sent for analysis, but without a suspect to match it against. It provided limited help. Detective Rivera, the lead investigator, interviewed each of us separately and together, trying to piece together a timeline and motive. "Do you have any enemies?" he asked me, his kind eyes belying the seriousness of his question. "Anyone who might wish you harm or has shown unusual interest in you?" I shook my head. "No one." "What about at school? Any issues with classmates or teachers?" Again, I could think of nothing. I was an average student with a small circle of friends. I wasn't involved in drama or conflict. I was, by most measures, unremarkable. The level of obsession shown here suggests someone who knows you, the detective pressed. The photographs date back several months. This person has been watching you for a long time. The thought made me physically ill. How had I not noticed? How had I walked through my days blissfully unaware of the eyes that tracked my every move? We couldn't stay in the house while the investigation continued. My parents took us to a hotel in the next town, where we occupied adjoining rooms and jumped at every sound. Benjamin was hailed as a hero by local media, though he seemed deeply troubled by having shot someone, regardless of the circumstances. Days passed with no significant breaks in the case. The blood analysis confirmed only that the intruder was male. No matching DNA was found in any criminal database. The photographs yielded no fingerprints. Even the campsite provided few clues about the intruder's identity. My parents decided that returning to our home was out of the question. Within a week, they had rented a house on the other side of town, a temporary solution while they looked for a new permanent residence. The woods that had once been our playground now represented a threat too grave to live alongside. I didn't return to school immediately. My parents arranged for me to receive counseling to help process the trauma, and my teachers sent assignments that I half-heartedly completed in our rental house. When I finally did return to classes, I found myself the unwilling center of attention. Classmates stared and whispered. Some asked intrusive questions about what had happened. Others avoided me entirely, as if my experience might somehow be contagious. Through it all, a question nagged at me. Why me? What had made me the focus of such obsessive attention? I was neither the prettiest girl in school nor the most popular. I had no special talents that would attract unusual notice. I was just me. Detective Rivera visited regularly with updates that weren't really updates at all. We're pursuing several leads, he would say, though his expression told me these leads were insubstantial at best. We'll find him, Mia. It's just a matter of time. But time continued to pass without answers. 2 weeks became a month, and the investigation seemed to stagnate. The media lost interest as newer stories commanded attention. The police presence around our temporary home gradually diminished. Life, for everyone except my family, began to return to normal. For us, however, normalcy remained elusive. My brothers and I traveled to and from school in a parent-driven carpool. We maintained strict check-in procedures, texting when we arrived somewhere, texting before we left. Our new home bristled with security technology, cameras, motion sensors, panic buttons. We lived in a self-imposed state of lockdown. And still, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the masked figure was biding his time, waiting for an opportunity to finish what he had started. As it turned out, my instincts were correct. November blurred into December. The investigation remained open but inactive. We went through the motions of celebrating Thanksgiving in our rental house, each of us forcing smiles that didn't reach our eyes. The upcoming Christmas season brought no joy, only a reminder that our lives had been fundamentally altered. I tried to adjust to our new reality. I rejoined the school choir, resumed friendships that had grown distant during my absence, and attempted to focus on normal teenage concerns, grades, social dynamics, the future. But beneath this veneer of adaptation, I remained hypervigilant. I analyzed every stranger's face, questioned every coincidence, and startled at unexpected sounds. The second encounter occurred on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December. Winter had arrived early that year, bringing a rare snowfall that transformed Pinecrest into a scene from a holiday card. I had stayed late at school for choir practice, and my father was picking me up on his way home from work. Practice ran longer than expected. By the time we finished, darkness had fallen and most of the school was empty. I texted my father, who replied that he was running 15 minutes late due to the snow-slowed traffic. No problem, I assured him. I would wait in the main lobby where security cameras and the presence of janitorial staff made me feel relatively secure. I sat on a bench near the entrance, watching snowflakes swirl under the parking lot lights. Most of the faculty had already left, their cars creating dark voids in the otherwise snow-covered lot. The school felt eerily quiet, with only the distant sound of vacuum cleaners and the occasional announcement over the intercom system breaking the silence. Was scrolling through my phone when I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot. They were partially obscured by falling snow, but I could make out the basic silhouette, tall, lean, hands in pockets. Something about their stillness sent a warning signal through my body. I looked down at my phone, pretending I hadn't noticed them while surreptitiously texting my father. "Please hurry." When I glanced up again, the figure had moved closer, now standing under one of the parking lot lights. My breath caught in my throat. Though they weren't wearing the mask, I recognized the stance, the build, the deliberate way they moved. It was him, I was certain of it. I abandoned any pretense of calm, immediately calling my father. "Dad," I said as soon as he answered, my voice tight with fear. "He's here. The person who broke into our house. He's in the school parking lot." "I'm 5 minutes away," my father replied, his voice sharp with alarm. "Where are you exactly?" "Main lobby," I whispered, moving away from the windows and closer to the security desk. "Mr. Winters is still here." The night security guard had noticed my distress and was approaching with a concerned expression. "Stay with him," my father instructed. "I'm calling the police. Don't go outside no matter what." I nodded, then remembered he couldn't see me. "Okay." Mr. Winters reached my side. "Everything all right, Mia?" I pointed toward the parking lot. "There's someone out there who's been stalking me. My dad's on his way and he's calling the police." The security guard's expression hardened as he peered through the glass doors. "Where?" he asked, scanning the lot. "Under the light near the bus lane," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I realized the figure was no longer there. "He was just there, I swear." Mr. Winters didn't question me. "Let's move away from the doors," he suggested, guiding me toward the security desk. He picked up a walkie-talkie and spoke into it. "Jim, we've got a potential situation at the main entrance. Can you do a perimeter check? Focus on the bus lane and faculty parking." A crackled affirmative came through the device. Mr. Winters then picked up the desk phone, presumably to contact local authorities himself. I kept my eyes fixed on the parking lot, scanning for any movement. For a brief, hopeful moment, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, if my trauma-induced hypervigilance had conjured a threat from an innocent bystander. Then I saw him again. Not in the parking lot this time, but pressing his face directly against the glass door, hands cupped around his eyes to see inside. His face, now visible without the mask, was unnervingly ordinary, neither handsome nor ugly, with features so generic they would be difficult to describe to a sketch artist. But his eyes held an intensity that sent ice through my veins. He smiled when our gazes met, a small, knowing expression that promised this wasn't over. I screamed, pointing, and Mr. Winters whirled around. The man didn't flee immediately. He held my gaze for one more excruciating second before calmly walking, not running, away from the doors and back into the snowy night. "That's him," I gasped. "That's the person who broke into our house." Mr. Winters rushed to the doors, walkie-talkie in hand. "Jim, suspect heading toward the eastern exit. Male, approximately 6 feet, dark clothing." He hesitated, clearly torn between following protocol by staying with me and pursuing the intruder. "Stay here," he finally decided. "Lock yourself in the office. Don't open the door for anyone except me, your father, or the police." He pressed a key into my hand and pointed to a small office behind the security desk. I nodded, too frightened to speak, and ran to the indicated room. Once inside, I locked the door and retreated to the farthest corner, where I slid to the floor with my back against the wall. Minutes crawled by. I heard sirens in the distance, growing louder. My phone vibrated with a text from my father. 2 minutes away. "Are you safe?" "In security office," I typed back with trembling fingers. Locked door. "Police coming." The next 20 minutes were chaos. Police officers swarmed the school grounds, searching every building in the surrounding area. My father arrived and was eventually allowed to join me in the security office, where he held me as I shook with delayed shock and fear. Despite the rapid response and extensive search, they didn't find the stalker. He had vanished into the snowy night, leaving only footprints that disappeared at the edge of the woods behind the school. Woods that connected, through miles of undeveloped land, to the forest behind our former home. He knew where to find me, I told Detective Rivera when he arrived to take my statement. He knew my schedule, knew I would be here late today. The detective's expression was grim. We'll check the school's attendance records, look into substitute teachers, maintenance staff, anyone who might have access to student schedules. You don't understand, I insisted. He's been watching me this whole time, even after we moved. He's never stopped. Rivera couldn't deny this possibility. The evidence, both from the original break-in and now this second sighting, suggested a level of obsession and determination that was truly alarming. We're increasing patrols around your home and school, he assured me. And I'm assigning an officer to escort you to and from school until we catch this guy. I nodded, but the measures felt inadequate against someone so persistent. Someone who had been shot and still returned. Someone who seemed to anticipate our every move. That night in our rental house with a police car parked outside, I finally asked the question that had been haunting me. What does he want from me? My parents had no answer. Neither did my brothers, nor Detective Rivera, nor the victim advocate who visited the next day. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and terrifying in its implications. Whatever he wanted, I was certain of one thing: he wouldn't stop until he got it. January arrived with bitter cold and renewed fear. The police escort became a fixture in my life. Officer Ramirez in the mornings, Officer Chen in the afternoons. I felt simultaneously protected and exposed. The police presence a constant reminder of the danger that continued to lurk. The investigation had expanded. Detective Rivera and his team were reviewing every aspect of my life and our family's history, searching for any connection to the stalker. They interviewed extended family members, former neighbors, my parents' colleagues, and classmates. School became an ordeal. Despite the administration's efforts to maintain my privacy, everyone knew about the police escort and the second encounter before winter break. Some students avoided me entirely. Others followed me with morbid curiosity, as if expecting to witness something dramatic. A few well-meaning friends tried to offer support, but they couldn't understand what I was going through. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Noah, my quiet, observant brother, had been spending hours online, researching similar cases and reviewing news articles about stalking incidents. One evening in late January, he called a family meeting in our living room. I found something, he said, opening his laptop on the coffee table. I've been looking into unresolved cases with similar patterns: home invasion, stalking, photography. My parents exchanged worried glances. They had been trying to limit our exposure to frightening information, believing it would only increase our anxiety. Noah, I'm not sure this is helpful, my mother began. But my brother shook his head. Just look, he insisted, turning the screen to face us. The article displayed was from a small newspaper in Idaho, dated 3 years earlier. The headline read, "Local teacher arrested on stalking charges." Beneath it was a mugshot of a man I didn't recognize, middle-aged, with thinning hair and glasses. I don't understand, I said, scanning the article. Who is this? His name is Howard Gaines, Noah explained. He was a substitute teacher in Boise who was arrested for stalking a 14-year-old student. He took photographs of her, broke into her home, and exhibited obsessive behavior that matches what's happening to Mia. My father leaned forward, reading more carefully. It says he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Noah nodded, which means he would have been released about a year ago. But that's not the important part. He clicked to another tab, displaying a different article from 6 months earlier. After his release, he disappeared, violated his parole, and vanished. The authorities believe he may have assumed a new identity. We all fell silent, processing this information. The timing aligned. The behavior pattern matched. But there was still a missing piece. How would he have found Mia? My mother asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. We've never lived in Idaho. We don't know this man. Noah hesitated, then opened a third tab. This one showed a school photograph. Not mine, but of another girl with striking similarities to me. The same long dark hair, similar facial features, even a comparable build. This is Jessica Reeves, Noah said quietly. The girl he stalked in Idaho. The resemblance was uncanny, We could have been sisters or at least cousins. I think he found Mia by chance, Noah continued. Maybe he was passing through town, saw her, and it triggered the same obsession. The article mentions that part of his psychosis was a fixation on a specific type of girl. Detective Rivera was at our house within an hour of our call. He examined Noah's research with a mixture of professional interest and concern. "This is good work," he told my brother. "Very good work. We'll follow up on Howard Gaines immediately." The detectives team moved with newfound urgency. They obtained Gaines's complete file from Idaho authorities, including detailed psychiatric evaluations. They circulated his photograph to local businesses, shelters, and hotels. They examined recent rental applications and job inquiries throughout the region. For the first time since the ordeal began, I felt a glimmer of hope. Knowing the stalker's identity, having a name and a face to attach to the terror, somehow made it more manageable. It transformed an amorphous threat into something concrete, something that could be fought. 3 days later, Detective Rivera returned with an update. "We've located a motel room rented to a man matching Gaines's description," he told us. "He's using the name Harold Grimes, but the ID is fake. We're setting up surveillance now." The next 24 hours were tense. My parents insisted that my brothers and I stay home from school, and none of us objected. We huddled in the living room, watching mindless television and jumping at every sound. No one mentioned the surveillance operation, but it dominated our thoughts nonetheless. The call came at 3:17 p.m. Detective Rivera's voice was taut with controlled excitement. "We've got him," he said simply. "Howard Gaines is in custody." Relief washed over me in a dizzying wave. My mother began to cry. My father sat down hard on the nearest chair. My brothers exchanged glances of disbelief and cautious celebration. "Is it really over?" I asked, afraid to trust the feeling of safety that was beginning to take root. "It looks that way," Detective Rivera replied, his voice softening. "We found evidence in his motel room that confirms his identity and his fixation. I can't share all the details yet, but yes, Mia, I believe it's over." The evidence they discovered was even more disturbing than we had imagined. In Gaines's motel room, police found hundreds of photographs of me plastered across the walls. They discovered journals detailing his observations and fantasies. Most chillingly, they found a crude duplicate of the mask he had worn during the home invasion, along with a small collection of items stolen from our original house, a hairbrush containing strands of my hair, a charm bracelet I thought I had lost months before the break-in, and a pillowcase from my bed. The bullet wound in his shoulder had never been properly treated. He had performed crude self-surgery, using supplies purchased at various pharmacies across 3 counties. The wound had become infected, leaving him with limited mobility in his right arm, a fact that may have saved my life during our final encounter. Howard Gaines didn't deny his actions. In fact, during interrogation, he spoke about his obsession with clinical detachment, as if discussing a scientific observation rather than a reign of terror. He explained how he had first seen me at a shopping mall nearly a year before the break-in, how the resemblance to Jessica Reeves had triggered something in him that he described as recognition of destiny. He was charged with multiple felonies, breaking and entering, assault, stalking, illegal possession of firearms found in his motel room, violation of parole, identity fraud, and attempted kidnapping. The prosecution added an enhancement for targeting a minor, ensuring that if convicted on all counts, he would likely spend the remainder of his life in prison. I attended the preliminary hearing accompanied by my parents and Detective Rivera. It was the first time I had seen Gaines in person, without the mask or the distortion of fear and darkness. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I expected to feel terror, but instead found only pity mixed with revulsion. This broken man had held such power over my life, had turned my world upside down, yet sitting there in the harsh fluorescent lighting, he seemed pathetic. He pled guilty to all charges, sparing us the ordeal of a full trial. The judge sentenced him to 30 years without possibility of parole, to be served in a maximum security facility with mandatory psychiatric treatment. The legal chapter of our nightmare had closed with surprising swiftness, but the emotional aftermath continued. I began working with Dr. Halston, a therapist specializing in trauma recovery. "Healing isn't linear," she cautioned during our first session. "You'll have good days and bad days, progress and setbacks. All of that is normal." She was right. There were nights when I still woke gasping from nightmares where masked figures chased me through endless woods. Days when a stranger's glance held for too long would send me into a spiral of paranoia. Moments when the simple act of looking out a window after dark seemed impossible. But there were other days, increasingly frequent as winter gave way to spring, when I felt almost normal. When I could laugh without the sound catching in my throat. When I could walk through the school hallways without constantly looking over my shoulder. My family faced their own healing journeys. Benjamin struggled with guilt, convinced he should have protected me better. Tanner developed anxiety that manifested in stomach pains and insomnia. Noah retreated further into his quiet watchfulness, though his research skills had found a more positive outlet in the school newspaper. My parents attended family therapy with us, learning to balance vigilance with the need to let us grow and live without fear. We never returned to our house near the woods. My parents sold it that spring to a young couple who knew nothing of its history. Our rental became our permanent home, its location in a densely populated neighborhood offering a security that isolation never could. As for me, I gradually reclaimed pieces of my life. I rejoined the choir and discovered that singing helped quiet the anxious thoughts that sometimes overwhelmed me. I reconnected with friends who had been patient during my withdrawal. I even started dating in my junior year, though my first boyfriend had to endure an intensive background check from my father and Benjamin. The woods, once my childhood playground, remained a complicated symbol in my mind. I couldn't bring myself to walk among trees for nearly 2 years after Gaines's arrest. The thought of being surrounded by potential hiding places, of not being able to see clearly in all directions was too triggering. But during my senior year, as part of my therapy, I finally returned to a forest, a different one in a state park an hour from home, accompanied by my entire family and Dr. Halston. Standing among those towering trees, feeling the dappled sunlight on my face and hearing the rustle of leaves in the breeze, I experienced a profound realization. The woods themselves had never been the threat. They had merely been the setting where a disturbed individual had chosen to enact his obsession. The trees had neither sheltered nor betrayed me. They were simply trees, neutral witnesses to human actions both beautiful and terrible. That day marked a turning point in my recovery. I understood that while caution was necessary in life, fear could not be allowed to define it. Howard Gaines had stolen enough of my peace. I would not surrender anymore. Today, as I write this account, I am 16 years old. 2 years have passed since the masked figure first appeared at our sliding glass door. I still carry the scars of that time, visible in small habits. The way I always sit facing doorways in public places, how I check the locks twice before bed, my preference for well-lit spaces. But these are manageable adaptations, not crippling limitations. I share this story not to frighten you, but as a testament to human resilience. To show that even when terror invades the ordinary spaces of life, when safety seems like an impossible dream, healing remains possible. The path forward isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about integrating it into a life that refuses to be defined by its darkest moments. The watcher in the woods no longer watches me, and I, in turn, no longer watch for him. Instead, I look forward, toward a future where the shadows hold no power over where I choose to walk. The weight of my grandfather's story has haunted 3 generations of my family. I never met him myself. He died in 1947 when my father was only 12. But the terror in his tale has been preserved with disturbing clarity through the decades. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better had he taken this nightmare to his grave. My grandfather, Thomas Harrington, was born in Greenwich, Connecticut in 1900. A practical man with calloused hands and a straight-talking manner, he found joy in simple pleasures, fishing in quiet streams, camping under star-filled skies and the satisfying work of mechanics. These weren't merely hobbies but essential elements of his character, ways he connected with the world on his own terms. It was during one of his final conversations with my father that he first revealed what had happened in Port Chapman, Alaska between 1938 and 1942. I've pieced together the account from my father's recollections, fragments of journal entries and newspaper clippings preserved in our family's archives. The details emerged slowly over time, as if the full horror was too much to absorb at once. "Dad," my father once told me, his voice dropping to a whisper despite us being alone in the room, "your grandfather was never the same after Alaska. Something fundamental broke in him there." According to my father, Thomas initially loved Port Chapman. The remote Alaskan settlement offered pristine wilderness, abundant fishing, and a small community where his mechanical skills were highly valued. He quickly established himself as a reliable handyman who could fix anything from boat motors to generators, essential skills in a place so removed from civilization. In the evenings, Thomas would frequent the town's only bar, the Northern Light. There, trappers, fishermen, and locals would gather to escape the isolation, sharing stories that ranged from practical wilderness advice to tall tales meant to entertain. It was in this dimly lit establishment, with its perpetual smell of pipe tobacco and whiskey, that Thomas first heard the whispers about something wrong in the surrounding forests. "The woods have eyes," an old trapper named Howard had muttered one evening, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering lantern light. "Been that way long before any white man set foot here." Others nodded knowingly, but they all seemed reluctant to elaborate. Thomas, being new to the area, had dismissed it as local superstition, a mistake he would come to regret deeply. It wasn't until late autumn of 1938 that Thomas began to understand the true nature of these warnings. A hunter named Joseph Keller had staggered into the Northern Light one evening, his face ashen and his typically steady hands trembling uncontrollably. The bar fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. "I saw it," Joseph whispered, collapsing into a chair. "God help me, I saw it." Thomas watched as the bartender poured Joseph a double shot of whiskey without being asked. The hunter downed it in one swallow, some color returning to his face. "What happened out there, Joe?" someone finally asked. Joseph's account emerged in fragments punctuated by long silences. He'd been tracking a moose near Blackwater Ridge, about 15 miles from town. As dusk approached, he'd decided to make camp for the night rather than risk the journey back in darkness. "I was just setting up my tent when I heard it," Joseph said, his voice cracking. "A grizzly," I thought. Biggest damn grizzly I'd ever seen. But then, his hands began to shake again as he described what happened next. The massive shape he'd spotted wasn't moving like any bear he'd encountered in his 30 years of hunting. It had walked upright through the trees with an unnatural smoothness, observing him from a distance. Then it screamed, Joseph said, his eyes wide with remembered terror. Not a bear's roar. Not an elk. Not anything I've ever heard before or since. It was almost human, but wrong. So wrong. The scream had paralyzed Joseph with fear. He'd remained frozen by his half-assembled tent as darkness fell completely. Throughout the night he could hear movement circling his campsite, branches snapping under heavy weight, and occasional sounds like low, guttural breathing. "It was toying with me," Joseph whispered, "playing with me like a cat with a mouse. I just knew, it could have taken me any time it wanted." When dawn finally broke, Joseph had abandoned his gear and ran all the way back to Port Chapman, stopping only when his legs gave out beneath him. My grandfather told my father how the locals had exchanged knowing glances throughout Joseph's story. This wasn't the first time they'd heard such an account, though it was perhaps the most detailed. There had been people who went missing before, Thomas had explained to my father. But after Joseph's story, it got worse. Much worse. The winter of 1938-1939 was particularly harsh in Port Chapman. Heavy snowfall isolated the community for weeks at a time, and temperatures plummeted to record lows. Under normal circumstances, the residents would have banded together, finding strength in their shared struggle against the elements. But that winter, Thomas noticed a different atmosphere settling over the town like a shroud. People traveled in groups even for short distances. No one ventured into the surrounding forest unless absolutely necessary. Windows were boarded not just against the cold but against what might be watching from the tree line. The northern light remained busy, but conversations were hushed, and laughter became increasingly rare. Thomas threw himself into his work, repairing equipment damaged by the extreme cold and helping to maintain the town's vital generators. The practical demands of survival provided some distraction from the growing sense of unease, but even he couldn't ignore the changes taking place around him. It was Howard, the old trapper, who first approached Thomas directly about what was happening. "You're new here," Howard said one evening, sliding onto the stool beside Thomas at the bar. "So you don't know the history." Thomas recalled Howard's weathered face, lined with deep creases that spoke of decades spent in the harsh Alaskan wilderness. His left eye was clouded by cataracts, but his right remained sharp and alert. "What history?" Thomas asked. Howard took a long sip of his drink before answering. The natives called this place the Valley of Shadows. They wouldn't hunt here, wouldn't even pass through if they could avoid it. Said the land was cursed, inhabited by something neither animal nor man. Thomas had wanted to dismiss this as superstition, but Howard's next words had chilled him to the bone. "Every 11 years. It gets worse," Howard continued, his voice dropping to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "People disappear. Animals flee. And those who venture too deep into the woods don't come back whole, if they come back at all." "Why 11 years?" Thomas had asked. Howard shrugged. "Who knows? Some natural cycle, maybe. Or maybe whatever's out there gets hungry on a schedule. All I know is the last bad period was in 27, and folks around here are counting the days until spring, hoping it passes us by this time." But it didn't pass them by. As January gave way to February, and the deep winter maintained its grip on Port Chapman, the first disappearance occurred. It was William Monroe, a seasoned trapper who had lived in Port Chapman for over 20 years. He'd ventured out to check his lines during a brief break in the weather and never returned. 3 days later, a search party found his sled overturned near Raven Creek, about 7 miles from town. His dogs were gone, not just dead but vanished completely. Of William himself, they found only his rifle, snapped in half as if by immense strength, and a trail of blood leading into a densely wooded ravine. The search party followed the trail until the light began to fade. No one was willing to remain in the forest after dark, not even to find their missing friend. They returned to town with grim faces and refused to discuss what they had seen in those woods. Thomas heard rumors, though. Whispers about massive inhuman footprints in the snow, about trees that had been marked with claw marks over 10 feet from the ground, about the unnatural silence that had enveloped the forest. No birds, no small animals, nothing alive making a sound. 2 weeks after William's disappearance, a young couple vanished from a cabin just outside town. They were found 3 days later, or rather parts of them were found. The discovery was made by their nearest neighbor, who immediately packed his belongings and left Port Chapman altogether, refusing to describe exactly what he had seen. By March, panic had taken hold of the community. Multiple families abandoned their homes, braving the still dangerous mountain passes to escape. Those who remained lived in a state of constant vigilance. No one ventured outside alone, even in daylight. Weapons were carried openly, though privately many admitted that bullets seemed useless against whatever was stalking them. Thomas considered leaving several times but found himself unable to abandon the people who had welcomed him into their community. His skills were needed more than ever, as equipment failures could now mean death for those who depended on heat and light to survive the remaining weeks of winter. It was during this period that Thomas had his own encounter, an experience he shared with my father only once, in the final days before his death in 1947. He had been repairing a generator at the edge of town when darkness fell more quickly than he had anticipated. Finishing his work by a lantern light, Thomas gathered his tools and prepared for the half-mile walk back to his lodgings. The night was clear and bitingly cold, the stars unusually bright above the snow-covered landscape. Halfway home, Thomas became aware of an odd sensation, a pressure in his ears. as if the atmosphere around him had suddenly changed. He stopped, listening intently. The normal sounds of the night, the distant hum of generators, the occasional creak of snow-laden branches, had disappeared completely. The silence was absolute and profoundly unnatural. Then he heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound from the tree line to his right, something moving through the snow, something large but unnervingly quiet for its size. Thomas stood frozen, his toolbox clutched in numb fingers as the sound circled around behind him. He would later tell my father that what terrified him most was the intelligence he sensed behind the movement. This was not the random wandering of an animal. Whatever watched him from the darkness was calculating, patient, and fully aware of the fear it inspired. For what seemed like an eternity, Thomas remained perfectly still, afraid that even the slightest movement might provoke an attack. The presence continued to circle him, always just out of sight, occasionally allowing a branch to snap or snow to crunch. Deliberate sounds, Thomas believed, meant to heighten his terror. Just as his legs began to tremble from the strain of standing motionless in the bitter cold, Thomas heard a commotion from town. Voices shouted in alarm and lights appeared as people emerged from buildings with lanterns and flashlights. The presence in the darkness retreated. The unnatural silence lifted, and Thomas found himself able to move again. He ran toward the lights, his breath coming in ragged gasps that formed white clouds in the freezing air. He discovered that another resident, an elderly man named George Phillips, had been found dead in his home. Not from natural causes, but from terror. George had been alone when something apparently tried to enter his small cabin. The window beside his bed had been smashed inward, and George had died clutching his chest, his face frozen in an expression of absolute horror. Most disturbing of all, Thomas learned that George's cabin was on the opposite side of town from where he had experienced his encounter with the unseen watcher. Whatever had been stalking Thomas in the darkness was not the same entity that had terrified George to death, or there was more than one of them. The following day, a town meeting was held to discuss what could be done. The debate was heated, with some advocating for a complete evacuation of Port Chapman, and others insisting they should organize hunting parties to track and kill whatever was terrorizing them. Howard, the old trapper, spoke last. His voice, usually weathered and gruff, had taken on a hollow quality that silenced the room. "You won't kill it," he said simply. "Better men than us have tried. Better men than us have died trying." "Then what do we do?" someone demanded. "Just wait to be picked off one by one?" Howard's gaze swept across the crowded room. "We survive. We stay together. We don't go into the woods alone. And we pray that spring comes early this year." It was then that Thomas made his decision. He would leave Port Chapman as soon as weather permitted. The community had become like a family to him over the months, but he recognized the hopelessness in Howard's eyes, the resignation of a man who had seen this cycle before and knew there was no fighting it. Thomas confided his plan to leave to only a few trusted friends. One was Benjamin Walsh, the town's doctor and one of the few educated men in Port Chapman. Benjamin had been documenting the strange occurrences, collecting accounts from witnesses and examining what physical evidence could be found. "I don't blame you for wanting to leave," Benjamin told Thomas during their final conversation. "But I need you to promise me something. If I don't make it out of here, take this with you." He handed Thomas a sealed envelope, surprisingly heavy for its size. "It's everything I've collected about what's happening here. Descriptions, patterns, theories. There's something else too. A map showing similar incidents across Alaska going back 50 years. Whatever's here isn't unique to Port Chapman." Thomas had promised to safeguard the information, though he admitted to my father that he had hoped never to need it. As March gave way to April, the first tentative signs of spring appeared in Port Chapman. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of frozen ground beneath. The days grew longer, providing more hours of precious daylight, and the mountain passes, blocked for months by massive snowdrifts, slowly became navigable again. Thomas wasn't the only one preparing to leave. Nearly half the remaining population had made similar plans, though few discussed them openly. There was a sense of shame and abandonment, even when staying meant likely death. The night before his planned departure, Thomas was awakened by urgent knocking at his door. It was Benjamin Walsh, his face haggard and his eyes wild with a combination of fear and excitement. "I know what they are," Benjamin said as soon as Thomas let him in. "Or at least I have a theory that explains everything." Thomas listened in growing horror as Benjamin outlined his conclusions. Based on indigenous legends, historical accounts, and his own observations, Benjamin believed they were dealing with something that had evolved in parallel with humans but in isolation. Something intelligent enough to recognize humans as threats or prey, strong enough to overpower even the most capable hunters, and patient enough to stalk its victims for days before striking. The 11-year cycle, Benjamin explained, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush, corresponds with a specific astronomical alignment. I've cross-referenced the timing of incidents going back to the first recorded attacks in 1872. It's always the same pattern. But why here? Thomas had asked. Why Port Chapman? Benjamin's expression darkened. Because we're building here, expanding, pushing into territories that have belonged to them for millennia. Each cycle gets worse because each cycle finds more humans encroaching on their domain. Before Thomas could respond, they heard it, a sound that made his blood turn to ice in his veins. A scream, neither fully animal nor human, echoing across the town from somewhere in the surrounding forest. It was quickly followed by another, then another, from different directions. "They're surrounding us," Benjamin whispered. "God help us all." What followed was a night of terror that Thomas could never bring himself to describe in full detail, even to my father. The creatures, whatever they were, didn't launch a direct assault on the town. Instead, they engaged in psychological warfare, screaming from the darkness, occasionally rushing forward only to retreat again, keeping the entire population in a state of panicked alertness until exhaustion began to take its toll. By dawn, 3 more residents had died, 2 from heart attacks brought on by fear, and 1 who had fired blindly into the darkness and somehow managed to shoot himself instead. Benjamin Walsh was among the missing, having rushed to assist a family on the outskirts of town and never returned. Thomas didn't wait any longer. He gathered what belongings he could carry, including Benjamin's sealed envelope, and joined a group of 15 others who had decided to leave immediately. Together they set out for the nearest neighboring settlement, a difficult 2-day journey even under good conditions. Only 11 of them completed that journey. The others were lost along the way, some to exposure and exhaustion, but at least 2 to whatever continued to stalk them from the wilderness. Thomas never saw what took them. He heard only screams cut suddenly short and the horrible sounds of something large moving swiftly through the underbrush. Thomas never returned to Port Chapman. After reaching safety, he continued south, eventually making his way back to Connecticut by the summer of 1939. He told few people about his experiences in Alaska, concerned that he would be dismissed as insane, or worse, that sharing the knowledge might somehow draw the attention of what he had encountered there. It wasn't until 1942 that Thomas heard news of Port Chapman again. A brief article in a newspaper reported that the remote Alaskan settlement had been found completely abandoned during a supply run. Personal belongings had been left behind, suggesting a hasty evacuation, but no bodies were discovered. The official explanation suggested that the residents had relocated due to the harsh living conditions, possibly exacerbated by the war. Thomas knew better. He had kept track of the 11-year cycle Benjamin had identified and realized that 1938-1939 had only been the beginning. The worst would have come in the winter of 1941-1942. After reading the newspaper account, Thomas opened Benjamin's envelope for the first time. Inside, he found detailed notes on the creature's behavior patterns, anatomical speculations based on the few physical traces they had left behind, and the promised map showing similar incidents across Alaska and parts of northern Canada. Most, Disturbing was a sealed inner envelope containing what appeared to be a large curved claw or talon, unlike anything from any known animal species. Accompanying it was a note in Benjamin's handwriting. Recovered from the body of William Monroe. Not bone, not keratin. Analysis inconclusive. Thomas kept these items hidden for the remainder of his life, showing them only to my father in the final days before his death in 1947. He extracted a promise that the information would be preserved but never widely shared. Some knowledge, he told my father, is too dangerous to spread. Not because people wouldn't believe it, but because some would. And they would go looking. My father kept his promise. He safeguarded Benjamin's documents in the mysterious claw, eventually passing them to me along with the full account of my grandfather's experiences in Port Chapman. I've spent years researching the incident, cross-referencing my grandfather's story with historical records and similar accounts from the region. What I've discovered is troubling. Port Chapman was indeed abandoned in 1942 and never resettled. The official records offer various explanations: economic factors, wartime resource allocation, the challenging environment. But deeper investigation reveals a pattern of similar abandonments across the region, always in remote areas, always following reports of animal attacks or unexplained disappearances. Benjamin's map has proven startlingly accurate. When I overlay it with more recent incidents, going well beyond the 1940s that marked the end of my grandfather's involvement, the pattern not only continues, but expands. Whatever stalked Port Chapman hasn't disappeared. It may be spreading. Most concerning of all is the timing. If Benjamin's theory about the 11-year cycle is correct, we're approaching another peak period of activity. And unlike in my grandfather's time, there are now far more communities, research stations, and tourist operations in the regions marked on his map. I've debated whether to make this information public. On one hand, a warning might save lives. On the other, as my grandfather feared, it might draw thrill-seekers and cryptid hunters to these dangerous areas, resulting in more deaths. For now, I maintain my family's cautious approach. This account and the evidence supporting it remains private, a burden passed down through generations. I've made arrangements for it to be preserved should anything happen to me, but I share it selectively and with great care. One thing is certain: whatever my grandfather encountered in those dark Alaskan woods has remained undiscovered by mainstream science. Perhaps that's for the best. Some predators are most dangerous once they know they've been seen, and some secrets are safer left in the shadows. But I still check the news from Alaska every day, watching for patterns in missing persons reports and unexplained incidents. And when I see them starting to cluster in the regions marked on Benjamin's aging map, I know the cycle has begun again. The woods are still watching. The shadows still hunger, and the 11-year cycle continues whether we acknowledge it or not. I've always loved my property on the outskirts of Pineville, nestled against 40 acres of dense woodland. The isolation offered peace after 15 years working in downtown Chicago's financial district. 3 years ago, at age 42, I decided corporate burnout wasn't worth the ulcers and anxiety medication, so I cashed out, bought this place, and started consulting remotely, just enough to maintain my lifestyle without the soul-crushing commute. The woods behind my house had always been a sanctuary until about 6 months ago, March 2019, when things began to change. First came the sounds at night, branches breaking under heavy footsteps, strange rustling that seemed to circle my property. Then small items disappeared from my back porch, a gardening trowel, work gloves, even a thermos I'd left out one evening. Local forums mentioned trespassers and illegal hunting in the area. The property adjoining mine had recently been purchased by someone I'd never met, supposedly for a hunting cabin. Construction noises had echoed through the trees for weeks, though I'd never ventured far enough to see the structure myself. As a precaution, I installed 3 trail cameras along my property line in early September, mounting them 8 feet high on sturdy oaks. They weren't anything fancy, just older film models my neighbor Thomas had given me when he upgraded to digital versions. Each could capture about 30 images before needing new film, but they'd serve my purpose, identifying whoever was encroaching on my land. The morning of September 16th started like any other Monday. I woke at 6, made coffee, answered emails, and prepared for a video conference at 9. By 7, I was backing out of my driveway when something caught my eye, a splash of white near the tree line that hadn't been there the previous evening. I parked and walked across the dewy grass for a closer look. The morning chill penetrated my light jacket as I approached what appeared to be scattered bones. Drawing closer, my stomach clenched. A complete deer skeleton lay arranged on the ground, picked impossibly clean. Not a scrap of flesh remained, not even the eyes, as if something had meticulously stripped every edible particle from the carcass. Kneeling beside it, I noticed small, dark stains on the bones. Blood still slightly tacky. This hadn't happened days ago. This was recent. Very recent. Standing, I spotted a narrow trail of blood droplets leading toward the woods. Without thinking, I followed it to the tree line where it disappeared into the undergrowth. My first camera should have captured whatever dragged this deer here. I located the tree where I'd mounted it, only to find splintered plastic scattered around the trunk. Someone or something had torn the camera down and smashed it beyond recognition. The film inside was mangled, exposed to light, and useless. A sick feeling grew in my stomach as I checked the other 2 cameras. Each had been destroyed just as thoroughly. Whoever had left the deer skeleton clearly didn't want to be identified. As I gathered the broken pieces, something caught my attention. A tuft of coarse, golden-brown hair snagged on a jagged edge of plastic. Too coarse for a deer, too long for a coyote. I placed it in my pocket, unsure why I felt compelled to keep it. Walking back to the skeleton, I took several photos with my phone. This wasn't a natural predator kill. The arrangement was too deliberate, too staged. Someone was sending a message. I called the county sheriff's office, and 2 hours later, Deputy Whitaker arrived. He examined the scene with practiced indifference. Probably coyotes, he suggested, despite my objections about the unusual placement and complete lack of flesh. Or teenagers playing pranks. When I mentioned the destroyed cameras, he finally showed interest. "You should have led with that," he said, making notes. "Destruction of property is something we can actually investigate." The game warden arrived shortly after, a weather-beaten woman named Johnson, who'd served the county for 20 years. She examined the bones with considerably more attention than the deputy had shown. "Never seen anything strip a carcass this clean with the skeleton intact," she murmured. "No scattered bones, no gnaw marks. This isn't natural predator behavior." She bagged the skeleton for further examination and promised to let me know if she found anything unusual. By noon, they were gone, leaving me alone with my unease and the certainty that something wasn't right in my beloved woods. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house settling jolted me awake. The wind through the trees seemed to carry whispers just below the threshold of comprehension. I checked and rechecked the locks on my doors and windows, feeling foolish yet unable to shake the sense of being watched. The next morning, I ordered new security cameras, high-end models with night vision, motion sensors, and cloud storage. I couldn't explain my growing anxiety to friends or family without sounding paranoid, but I couldn't ignore it either. While waiting for the new equipment to arrive, I decided to inspect my property line more thoroughly. Armed with a walking stick and my phone, I set out after breakfast. The September sun filtered through golden leaves, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. 20 minutes into my walk, I discovered a crude path I hadn't noticed before. Vegetation trampled down in a straight line from deeper in the woods toward my property. Following it cautiously, I soon found myself looking at the back of a small cabin, approximately 200 yards into the neighboring property. The structure was simple, single-story, metal roof, wooden walls weathered as though it had stood for years rather than months. No vehicles were visible, no smoke from the chimney. The windows reflected the morning light, preventing me from seeing inside. As I stood observing from a distance, the distinct feeling of being observed in return crawled up my spine. Nothing moved within my field of vision, yet I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes tracking my movements. After several uncomfortable minutes, I retreated home, frequently glancing over my shoulder. That afternoon, I visited the county records office. The adjacent property had indeed been purchased 6 months earlier by someone named Westfield. No first name was listed, just an LLC based in Nevada. The clerk couldn't provide additional information, but mentioned that property taxes had been paid in advance for 5 years. When my security system arrived 2 days later, I spent the entire day installing cameras around my house covering every approach. I also mounted motion-activated floodlights at strategic points. The system linked to my phone, allowing me to monitor the feeds remotely. That night, the first notification came at 11:47 p.m., motion detected at the edge of my yard. The footage showed nothing but shadows shifting in ways that seemed inconsistent with the wind. I increased the sensitivity and waited. At 2:15 a.m., another alert. This time, the camera captured a dark figure at the tree line, just at the edge of the floodlight's reach. The image was grainy, the figure too distant for clear identification. Humanoid in shape, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. Before I could process what I was seeing, it retreated into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night or much the following nights either. Each evening brought similar alerts: motion at the property edge, glimpses of something watching from the trees, but never clear enough for identification. I began to doubt my own perception. Was exhaustion causing me to see patterns where none existed? On the 5th night, everything changed. The alerts began at midnight. First one camera, then another, then 3 simultaneously. Whatever lurked in the woods was circling my house, staying just out of clear view. At 3:27 a.m., a tremendous crash from my back porch sent me scrambling for the baseball bat I'd begun keeping beside my bed. Heart pounding, I checked the camera feed. My porch furniture had been overturned, planters smashed. Something had torn through the screen door, leaving it hanging from a single hinge. I called the sheriff's office immediately. Deputy Whitaker arrived 45 minutes later, by which time I'd consumed enough coffee to make my hands tremble. Looks like vandalism, he concluded after a cursory examination. Any teenagers you've had trouble with? I explained that I barely knew anyone in town, let alone had enemies. When I showed him the camera footage of the shadowy figure, he squinted at my phone screen. Could be anyone. Could be a deer. Image is too poor for identification. Before leaving, he reluctantly agreed to increase patrols past my property for the next few nights, though his expression made clear he thought I was overreacting. After he left, I retrieved the camera memory cards and spent hours reviewing footage, searching for anything I might have missed. In one frame captured at 2:03 a.m., I noticed something glinting among the trees. 2 reflective points at approximately the height of human eyes, but spaced slightly too far apart. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and purchased additional security measures: stronger locks, window bars, and a shotgun I barely knew how to use. The clerk raised his eyebrows at my selections but asked no questions. I spent the remainder of daylight fortifying my home, all while feeling those invisible eyes watching from the forest edge. My research began in earnest the following day. Whatever was happening, I needed to understand it. I started with local news archives, searching for similar incidents in the area. Nothing matched exactly, but I found several reports of unusual animal deaths over the past decade. Livestock found completely drained of blood. Wild animals discovered with specific organs removed with surgical precision. Most had been dismissed as predator attacks or the work of cultists or disturbed individuals. None had been solved. Next, I searched property records for the surrounding area, particularly focusing on the land where the cabin stood. Before Westfield LLC purchased it, the property had belonged to the Harrington family for nearly 60 years. They'd sold it following the disappearance of their youngest son, Michael, in 2018. This new information led me to newspaper articles about the missing 20-year-old. Michael had last been seen hiking in the woods, these very woods, on a clear October day. Search parties found nothing but his backpack, abandoned near a stream half a mile from where I now lived. Something about the case nagged at me, though I couldn't identify what. I printed Michael's photograph, a smiling young man with sandy hair and glasses, and pinned it to my research board alongside maps of the area and notes about the strange occurrences. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. The knock at my door came just after sunset, startling me from my research. Through the security camera, I saw an elderly man leaning on a cane, harmless looking, though experience had taught me appearances meant little. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, shotgun within reach behind the entryway table. "Name's Harold Whitaker, Deputy Whitaker's father," came the reply. "Heard you've been having troubles. Thought I might provide some context." Something in his tone convinced me to open the door, though I remained wary. Harold looked to be in his 80s, with deeply lined features and cloudy blue eyes that held surprising sharpness. He declined my offer of coffee but accepted a seat at my kitchen table. "My son thinks you're jumping at shadows," he began without preamble. "But he wasn't raised here like I was. Doesn't know the history." I leaned forward. "What history?" Harold's gaze drifted to the window, where darkness had fully settled over the forest. "These woods have always had incidents. Animals found mutilated, hunters who never returned, strange lights and sounds that can't be explained." "You're talking about supernatural phenomena," I said skeptically. He shook his head. "I'm talking about patterns, events that repeat across generations. I can't tell you what's out there, but I know it's real. My grandfather recorded similar incidents in the 1930s. I experienced them in the 1970s. Now they're happening again." From his jacket, he removed a worn leather journal and placed it on the table between us. "My grandfather's accounts continued by my father, then me. Thought it might help you make sense of things." I accepted the journal, unsure whether to thank him or call for psychiatric assistance. "Why show me this?" "Because whatever's out there, it's chosen to reveal itself to you. That means you're either its next victim or the one who might finally understand what we're dealing with." He stood with difficulty. "Read it, return it when you're done. And whatever you do, don't go into those woods alone at night." After Harold left, I examined the journal, its pages yellowed, handwriting changing every few entries as it passed from one generation to the next. The earliest entry dated to 1932, describing a series of mutilated livestock and the disappearance of a local trapper. Later entries detailed similar patterns repeating approximately every 20 years. Unusual animal deaths followed by human disappearances, always during autumn months. The most recent entries, in Harold's shaky hand, ended in 1993 with the disappearance of a forest ranger whose body was never found. I read until my eyes burned, absorbing accounts of strange tracks, unidentifiable sounds, and glimpses of something that witnesses described only as wrong-looking. None offered concrete evidence or explanation, just documentation of repeating phenomena that local authorities consistently dismissed. Around 2 a.m., I reached a page containing a crude sketch drawn in 1957, a tall, thin figure with disproportionately long limbs standing at a forest edge. The accompanying note read simply, "It watches, always at the threshold, never fully seen." The image matched what my cameras had captured, the vague humanoid shape at the tree line. I closed the journal, suddenly aware of how silent my house had become. Outside, not even crickets chirped. The woods stood still, as if holding their breath. I checked my security feeds. Nothing moved on any camera, yet the oppressive feeling of being observed intensified. For hours I sat in my living room, shotgun across my lap, watching the motionless tree line until dawn finally broke the spell. Despite Harold's warning and my better judgment, I knew I needed to investigate the cabin. Whatever connection existed between the structure and the events surrounding my property, I couldn't ignore it. But I wasn't foolish enough to go unprepared or unannounced. I called Deputy Whitaker the next morning, explaining that I wanted to meet my neighbor and requesting an official escort. His exasperation was evident, but he agreed to accompany me that afternoon. "Just to put your mind at ease," he said. While waiting for the appointed time, I continued reviewing Harold's journal, finding an entry from 1974 that caught my attention. The Harrington boy claims to have found structures in the deep woods, arrangements of stone and wood that don't appear natural. His father forbade him from returning to the site. 3 weeks later, their hunting dogs disappeared. The Harrington name, connected to both the 1970s incidents and to Michael's recent disappearance, couldn't be coincidence. I searched online for information about the family and discovered that Gerald Harrington, Michael's father, had died just 2 months after selling the property, cause of death listed as heart failure. When Deputy Whitaker arrived at 3 o'clock, I shared none of this information, knowing it would only reinforce his opinion of my paranoia. He followed me along the crude path I'd discovered, his hand resting casually near his holstered weapon. "So you've never actually spoken to this neighbor?" he asked as we walked. "Never seen them," I confirmed. "Construction finished months ago, but I've noticed no regular occupancy, no vehicles, no lights at night. Probably a seasonal hunting cabin," he suggested. "Lots of city folks buy property out here, use it a few weeks a year." We emerged from the trees facing the cabin's back wall. In daylight, it appeared even more weathered than during my previous observation, the wood silvered with age that seemed impossible given its recent construction. Deputy Whitaker circled to the front, where a small porch supported a rocking chair. No vehicle was present. No footprints marked the dusty ground. He knocked firmly on the door, which swung open at his touch, clearly unlocked. "Hello? Sheriff's Department. Anyone home?" he called, hand moving to his weapon. Silence answered. After a moment, he stepped inside, motioning for me to remain on the porch. I watched through the doorway as he moved through the cabin's interior, his posture gradually relaxing. "Place is empty," he said, returning to the door. "Furnished but unused. No personal belongings, and may I look?" I asked. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Not officially sanctioned, but I don't see the harm. Just don't touch anything." The cabin's interior contradicted its weathered exterior. Everything inside appeared new and barely used. A small kitchenette with basic appliances occupied one corner. A neatly made bed stood against the far wall. A desk held a battery-powered lamp and blank notepad. "Nothing personal, nothing distinctive." "Told you," the deputy said. "Weekend hunting cabin. Mystery solved." I wasn't convinced. The place felt staged, too perfect, too empty of actual human presence. As the deputy examined the kitchenette, I noticed something odd about the floorboards near the desk. The spacing seemed irregular, one board slightly wider than the others. "We should go," I said, not wanting to draw attention to my observation. "Thank you for indulging me." Outside, Deputy Whitaker locked the door, explaining he'd contact the owner of record about our visit. As we walked back toward my property, I struggled to articulate the wrongness I'd sensed. "The cabin feels off," I finally said. No dust, yet clearly unoccupied. No supplies for hunting or outdoor activities. Nothing to indicate actual use. "Some people are minimalists," he replied dismissively, "and maybe they have a cleaning service." We parted at my property line, the deputy clearly considering the matter resolved. I waited until his vehicle disappeared down my driveway before doubling back to the cabin alone. This time I circled the structure carefully, examining its foundation and construction. The building seemed to sit directly on the ground without proper footings, unusual for a new structure and potentially explaining the accelerated weathering. The windows reflected the afternoon sun, preventing clear views inside. Moving to the rear, I noticed a small cellar door partially hidden by overgrowth, something neither the deputy nor I had spotted during our initial inspection. Common sense warned against investigating further alone, but curiosity overrode caution. The cellar door wasn't locked, lifting easily despite apparent age. Concrete steps descended into darkness. Using my phone's flashlight, I ventured down. The cellar was approximately 15 by 15 feet, with a packed earth floor and rough stone walls. Unlike the cabin above, this space showed clear signs of use. A metal table occupied the center, its surface stained dark. Shelves lined one wall holding jars containing unidentifiable objects suspended in liquid. My light caught something metallic in the corner, surgical instruments arranged precisely on a cloth. Beside them lay a leather-bound book similar to Harold's journal but newer. I should have left immediately. Instead, I opened the book. The contents weren't journal entries but detailed anatomical drawings, animals primarily, with careful annotations about organ systems, circulatory pathways, and nervous structures. The precision suggested medical training, Later pages contained similar drawings of human anatomy, labeled with clinical detachment. The final pages held photographs, deer, coyotes, and other wildlife arranged post-dissection. The last image made my blood run cold. Michael Harrington's driver's license photo paper-clipped to a blank page, awaiting documentation. I photographed several pages with trembling hands, then returned the book exactly as I'd found it. As I turned to leave, my flashlight illuminated a far corner I hadn't noticed before. A small mountain of animal bones, precisely sorted by type and size. Atop the pile sat a human skull. I fled the cellar, barely remembering to close the door behind me. The woods suddenly seemed alive with invisible watchers as I half ran back to my property, certain that I'd discovered something I was never meant to see. The sheriff arrived at my house within an hour of my call, accompanied by 2 deputies and a state police detective. I presented the photographs from the cellar along with my account, watching skepticism transform into grim concern as they scrolled through the images. "You should have waited for backup," Sheriff Miller admonished, though without real anger. "But this is concerning enough to warrant immediate investigation." They departed for the cabin while instructing me to remain home. Through my security cameras, I watched additional vehicles arrive. Crime scene technicians in white coveralls, the county medical examiner, even federal agents by nightfall. Around midnight, Sheriff Miller returned, looking exhausted and troubled. "We've secured the scene and removed considerable evidence," he reported, accepting my offer of coffee. "I can't share details of an ongoing investigation, but I can tell you we've found enough to indicate serious criminal activity." "The human remains?" I prompted. He hesitated. "Preliminary examination confirms they're human. Multiple individuals, some processed similarly to the animals you discovered." "And the owner?" "Westfield? The LLC traces back through several shells. We're working on it." He studied me over his coffee mug. "You should consider staying elsewhere for a few days." "Why?" "You found the source of the problem." His expression turned grave. "We've found a processing facility. We haven't found the individual responsible." That night, despite the increased police presence patrolling the area, the security alerts began again. Motion detected at multiple points along my property line. The cameras captured nothing distinct, yet the sensors continued triggering throughout the night. By morning, exhaustion and fear had hardened into determination. I packed essential documents, clothing, and Harold's journal into my car, planning to take the sheriff's advice and relocate temporarily. Before leaving, I made copies of everything I'd gathered, camera footage, research notes, journal excerpts, and mailed them to my sister in Seattle with instructions to contact authorities if she didn't hear from me within a week. As I loaded the final bag into my trunk, movement at the forest edge caught my attention. Something tall stood just within the tree line, motionless, watching. When I turned directly toward it, it withdrew deeper into the shadows. I drove to a motel 20 miles away, checking in under a pseudonym. From this safer distance, I organized my findings and continued researching. Local news now carried reports of the investigation, describing it as related to wildlife crimes and potential homicide, but offering few details. Social media filled the gaps with speculation about serial killers, organ harvesting, and cult activity. I focused on the Harrington family connection, discovering that Gerald Harrington had been a respected surgeon specializing in organ transplantation. Before his retirement in 2015, his son Michael had been studying biology at the State University before his disappearance. More significant was what I found about Gerald's grandfather, Dr. William Harrington, who'd practiced in the county during the 1930s. According to Historical Society records, he'd been known for unorthodox research interests and had disappeared in 1939 after accusations of grave robbing. His body was never found. The pattern described in Harold's journal, events repeating every 20 years, aligned with the Harrington family timeline. What if the phenomenon wasn't supernatural but generational? A family tradition of some twisted scientific pursuit? On my third day at the motel, Sheriff Miller called requesting an urgent meeting. We convened at a diner midway between town and my temporary lodging. "We've identified Westfield," he said without preamble. The LLC was established by Gerald Harrington before his death. Property transfer appears designed to obscure but not eliminate the family connection. You think Gerald was involved in whatever was happening in that cabin? Miller leaned forward. Medical examiner says the human remains show evidence of surgical precision. Some date back decades, others are recent. But here's what concerns me. Gerald Harrington was cremated according to records, yet we've found no evidence his son Michael is among the remains in the cellar. You think Michael could be responsible? Continuing his father's work? It's our leading theory. His education, the family history, the timing of events, it fits. But we haven't located him. I described my research into the Harrington family history, the pattern of incidents dating back generations. Miller listened without interruption, his expression increasingly troubled. I've authorized protective surveillance for your property, he said when I finished. We believe Michael Harrington may be living in the woods, possibly in some secondary structure we haven't located. If he's aware you discovered his operation, you could be at risk. I can't hide in motels forever, I replied. Just a few more days. We're conducting comprehensive searches of the surrounding forest. If he's out there, we'll find him. But something in the sheriff's voice betrayed doubt, the vastness of the forest, the difficulty of finding someone who didn't want to be found. If Michael Harrington had survived in those woods for over a year without detection, what chance did even an organized search have? That night in my motel room, I reviewed everything I'd learned, trying to form a coherent picture. A family of doctors conducting unauthorized research across generations, a pattern of animal and human disappearances, a watching presence that triggered security systems but avoided clear documentation. I recalled the tuft of golden brown hair found on my broken camera. On impulse, I searched for images of Michael Harrington, finding several from news reports about his disappearance. In each, he sported sandy blonde hair. Could the connection be that simple? A disturbed man living in the woods, continuing his family's twisted legacy? It seemed simultaneously too mundane and too horrific to accept. As I finally drifted toward sleep around 2 a.m., my phone pinged with a security alert from my home system. I opened the app to find all cameras simultaneously triggered, motion detected on all sides of my house. The footage showed nothing but darkness. Then at precisely the same moment, every camera went offline. I called Sheriff Miller immediately, then threw my belongings into the car and drove toward my property, ignoring both common sense and the sheriff's direct order to stay away. Something had compromised my entire security system simultaneously, something methodical and deliberate. The roads were empty at that hour, allowing me to make the 20-mile drive in record time. I stopped half a mile from my property, parking at a neighbor's farm with a clear view of my access road. Police vehicles were already present, lights flashing silently in the pre-dawn darkness. Using binoculars from my emergency kit, I observed officers moving around my property with tactical precision, weapons drawn. After 30 minutes of observation, Sheriff Miller emerged from my house accompanied by a state police captain. Their body language suggested confusion rather than alarm. My phone rang, Miller calling back. "System failure," he explained when I answered. "No signs of intrusion or tampering. Every camera simultaneously lost power despite independent battery backups. Engineers say it's technically impossible without physical access to each unit." "Yet it happened," I replied. "I'm nearby." "Coming home." He began to object, then sighed. "We've secured the property. Place is clear." Dawn was breaking as I pulled into my driveway. The property looked untouched. No broken windows, no forced doors, nothing missing or damaged inside. Yet every security camera had been meticulously disabled, not by cutting wires or breaking hardware, but by removing the batteries from each unit. The batteries themselves were missing entirely. "This took time and knowledge of your system," Miller observed as technicians examined the equipment. "No signs of entry, meaning?" "Someone had access to my security codes," I finished. "Or they watched me input them." The realization sent ice through my veins. How long had I been observed before becoming aware of the watcher? How many of my precautions had been compromised before implementation? By afternoon, Technicians restored my security system with new equipment and changed access codes. Miller assigned a deputy to remain on property overnight, though he couldn't commit to longer-term protection without evidence of direct threat. "The search continues," he assured me. "3 teams are working the woods systematically. We've found evidence of temporary camps, but nothing current." After they departed, leaving a single deputy parked at my driveway entrance, I felt oddly calm. The passive observation had shifted to active interference, a significant escalation that paradoxically made the threat more manageable because it was more concrete. Spent the remainder of daylight reviewing everything I'd learned and planning my response. If Michael Harrington was watching me, learning my routines and countering my precautions, I needed to act unpredictably. That evening, I made a show of securing the house for the night, turning lights off sequentially as if preparing for bed. The deputy remained in his vehicle, vigilant but stationary. Around midnight, I slipped out through a ground-floor window on the side of the house opposite the deputy's position, using landscaping for cover. Dressed in dark clothing and carrying a backpack containing essential supplies, I moved silently toward the forest edge. My destination wasn't the cabin, which remained under police surveillance, but deeper into the woods where Harold's journal had mentioned structures discovered in the 1970s. The half-moon provided just enough light to navigate without using my flashlight. Years of hiking had taught me to move quietly, placing each foot deliberately to avoid breaking branches. The forest opened before me, a maze of shadows and silver-touched foliage. I followed game trails where possible, moving steadily eastward away from both properties. After approximately 40 minutes, the terrain began to change, becoming rockier, with limestone outcroppings jutting from the earth like pale bones. In a small clearing surrounded by ancient oaks, I found the first structure, a crude shelter built into a hillside, its entrance concealed by strategic placement of fallen logs and living vegetation. Without Harold's description, I would have passed it without recognition. Heart pounding, I approached cautiously, listening for any sound that might indicate occupancy. Silence greeted me, not the natural quiet of the forest, but a complete absence of sound, as if the location existed in a vacuum. The entrance required crawling on hands and knees through a narrow passage that opened into a surprisingly spacious chamber approximately 8 feet in diameter. My flashlight revealed walls lined with shelves containing preserved specimens, plant material primarily, though some appeared to be small animal parts. A notebook lay open on a makeshift table fashioned from a flat stone balanced on smaller rocks. The handwriting matched that in the final pages of Harold's journal, a connection I filed away for later consideration. The notebook contained observations of plant and animal behavior in the surrounding forest, with particular attention to feeding patterns and territorial behaviors. Entries dated back decades but continued to recent months, suggesting regular visitation. Before I could examine it further, a sound from outside froze me in place, footsteps approaching deliberately, making no attempt at concealment. I extinguished my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall beside the entrance, pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps stopped just outside. A shadow blocked the faint moonlight filtering through the opening. "I know you're in there." The voice was male, cultured, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "You might as well come out. We have matters to discuss." For several heartbeats, I remained motionless, weighing my options. The narrow entrance would make escape difficult. I'd be vulnerable while crawling out. Staying put merely delayed the inevitable confrontation. "I've been observing you for some time," the voice continued conversationally. "You're more perceptive than most. More persistent, certainly." "Michael Harrington." I called, deciding that engagement from a position of apparent knowledge might provide advantage. A soft laugh answered me. "Very good. Though I haven't used that name in some time." "The police are searching for you," I said, moving slowly toward the entrance. "They know about the cabin." "The remains?" "Yes, unfortunate timing on your part. Years of work compromised." His tone held no anger, only mild disappointment. "Please come out. I give you my word I intend no immediate harm." The qualification, immediate, wasn't reassuring, but my options were limited. I crawled through the opening, emerging to find a tall figure standing several feet away, hands clasped casually behind his back. In the moonlight, I could make out his features: angular face, prominent brow, hair longer than in his photographs and now streaked with gray despite his relatively young age. He wore outdoor clothing of good quality, though visibly worn. Most striking were his eyes, pale and reflective in the minimal light, giving him an otherworldly appearance. "You've gone to considerable trouble to find me," he said, studying me with clinical interest. "Why?" The question caught me off guard. "You've been terrorizing me for months, leaving animal remains, destroying my cameras, breaking into my home." He tilted his head slightly. "Observing, evaluating. Your property borders territory I've utilized for specific research purposes for some time. Your arrival necessitated assessment." "Assessment for what?" "Threat potential, adaptability, response to stimulus." He gestured vaguely. "Standard protocols." His clinical detachment was more unsettling than overt aggression would have been. This wasn't a deranged killer, but something potentially more dangerous. A person who viewed others as specimens rather than individuals. "The cabin," I prompted, hoping to keep him talking while I assessed escape routes. "The human remains. My grandfather's work, continued by my father, now mine." He spoke as if discussing an ordinary family business. Anatomical research unrestricted by conventional limitations or ethics. Each generation improving upon the last. "You've been killing people." He frowned slightly. Such reductive terminology. The specimens were carefully selected, their contributions to knowledge significant. They were human beings. "As are you." His gaze intensified. "Yet you're different from the others. You noticed patterns, investigated systematically, demonstrated problem-solving capabilities beyond standard parameters." A horrible understanding began to form. The deer skeleton, the security system. They were tests. He nodded, pleased. "Precisely. Evaluating your observational skills, resource utilization, stress response. Most subjects either flee at the first sign of abnormality or refuse to acknowledge it entirely. You documented, analyzed, adapted." "I'm not a research subject," I said firmly, anger displacing fear. "Everyone is from a certain perspective." He stepped closer, moonlight highlighting the unnaturally smooth motion of his movements. "My family has studied human and animal physiology for generations, seeking to understand and perfect biological systems. My grandfather made the initial breakthroughs in the 1930s, extending life through systematic replacement of failing components. Organ harvesting," I translated, crude but accurate. "My father refined the techniques, focusing on neural integration and preservation. I've expanded further into biochemical enhancement and systemic modification." As he spoke, I noticed something odd about his proportions. Arms slightly too long, neck too flexible as he turned his head. Not dramatic differences, but cumulative details that registered as wrong. "What have you done to yourself?" I asked, unable to keep horror from my voice. "Applied my research," he replied simply. "Replaced inferior biological components with optimized versions. Enhanced musculature and sensory organs. Extended limitations. The golden brown hair on my broken camera. The strange proportions captured in distant footage. The unnatural movements. He had been modifying his own body using parts harvested from animals and humans." "You're insane," I whispered. "A label applied to any research substantially ahead of contemporary understanding," he replied without offense. "My grandfather was called mad. My father deranged. Yet their work advanced understanding of transplantation, rejection management, and neural preservation by decades. Advancements now used in legitimate medicine without acknowledgement of their origins." He began circling me slowly, examining me from different angles. "You present an interesting opportunity. Most subjects serve a single research purpose. You could contribute on multiple levels, both physiologically and cognitively." I backed away, maintaining distance. "The police know about you. They're searching these woods right now." "Yes, a complication requiring temporary adaptation, but woods are vast, officers few, and I've had years to prepare contingencies." His tone remained conversational, as if discussing mild weather inconvenience. "You've accelerated my timetable, certainly. The cabin laboratory is compromised, but the primary research facility remains secure." "There's another location," I realized aloud. "Much more extensive. My grandfather constructed the original framework during his time here. Each generation has expanded it. The cabin was merely a processing station, convenient but ultimately dispensable." As he spoke, distant shouts echoed through the trees, search teams communicating. Michael cocked his head, listening intently. "They're moving in this direction," he observed. "A conversation to be continued later, perhaps." Before I could respond, he turned and moved into the forest with astonishing speed, his form seeming to flow between trees rather than navigating around them. Within seconds, he had vanished into the darkness. I remained frozen momentarily, then scrambled toward the sound of voices, shouting for help as I ran. Within minutes, I encountered a search team led by Sheriff Miller himself, weapons drawn at my sudden appearance. "He was here," I gasped, pointing in the direction Michael had fled. "Just now, Michael Harrington." They mobilized immediately, calling in additional units and deploying in pursuit, though I knew the effort was futile. He moved through these woods with inhuman ability, knowing pathways and hiding places invisible to conventional search methods. As deputies escorted me back toward my property, I described the encounter, including Michael's reference to a primary facility. Miller looked grim but unsurprised. "We suspected something like this," he admitted. "The cabin was too exposed, too obvious for someone who's remained hidden this long. We've expanded the search radius but without specific location information." He didn't need to complete the thought. The forest covered thousands of acres of difficult terrain. Finding a well-concealed structure without guidance would be nearly impossible. "He'll come for me," I said with certainty. "He considers me some kind of research opportunity." Miller nodded solemnly. "We'll provide protection until we locate him. State police are bringing in additional resources tomorrow. Cadaver dogs, thermal imaging, the works." But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from the darkness between the trees, observed by eyes enhanced beyond normal human capability, evaluated by a mind that no longer operated within recognizable ethical boundaries. The following week passed in a blur of increased security and methodical searching. Additional officers were assigned to my property around the clock. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the forest daily. Teams with cadaver dogs combed the woods in expanding circles from the cabin. They found nothing significant. Occasional evidence of temporary camps, a few shallow graves containing animal remains, but no sign of a permanent facility or of Michael Harrington himself. I remained within my house, venturing outside only when necessary and always with an escort. Security cameras monitored every approach, now with redundant systems and regular equipment checks. Windows remained closed despite the pleasant autumn weather, curtains drawn against watching eyes. Yet despite these precautions, the sensation of being observed never diminished. At random intervals, all neighborhood dogs would begin barking simultaneously at nothing visible. Birds would suddenly go silent, their natural chatter replaced by unnatural stillness. Even the officers noticed it, moments when the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. On the 8th night after my encounter with Michael, I woke at 3:17 a.m. to find myself unable to move. Not paralysis. I could feel my limbs, sense the weight of blankets, but a profound heaviness preventing voluntary motion. My bedroom door stood open despite my certain memory of closing it before sleep. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, motionless, its proportions subtly wrong in ways my sleep-addled mind couldn't immediately process. I tried to shout for the officers stationed outside, but produced only a weak exhale. "Fascinating response," Michael's voice commented softly. "Adrenal surge without corresponding muscular activation. The chemical compound performs as designed." I struggled to speak, managing only a whispered, "How?" "Your protectors are temporarily indisposed. Nothing permanent, merely a sedative introduced through your home ventilation system. As for your security systems," he made a dismissive gesture, "technology remains predictable. Biological systems prove far more adaptable." He moved to my bedside with that unsettling fluid grace. In the dim light from outside, I could see his face more clearly. Familiar from photographs, yet fundamentally altered. The skin seemed too tight in some places, slightly loose in others, as if it hadn't been designed for the underlying structure. "I've come to propose an arrangement," he continued conversationally. "You've demonstrated exceptional observational capabilities and adaptive intelligence. These qualities are rare and valuable. You're harvesting people," I managed through the chemical restraint. A crude but understandable interpretation. He nodded. "My research requires biological components with specific characteristics. Previous subjects contributed posthumously. I'm offering you a different opportunity." "What opportunity?" My voice strengthened slightly as whatever he'd administered began to wear off. "Partnership. Collaboration in documentation and analysis. Your cognitive abilities combined with my specialized knowledge." He spoke as if offering legitimate employment. "You would retain autonomy while contributing to work of genuine scientific significance. You're a murderer." "I'm a researcher operating beyond conventional ethical limitations," he corrected mildly. "Progress requires sacrifice. My grandfather understood this, my father, now me. And if I refuse?" His expression remained unchanged. "Then you become a conventional subject rather than a collaborative one. Your contributions would be physiological rather than cognitive, less optimal but still valuable." The cold calculation in his voice made clear these weren't empty threats. To him, I represented research material, either willing or unwilling. Why me? I asked, playing for time as mobility gradually returned to my extremities. "Proximity initially, then demonstrated aptitude. You located my processing facility, identified historical patterns, tracked me to a secondary location. These actions indicate potential beyond ordinary parameters." As he spoke, I noticed something on the nightstand. My phone, screen dark but positioned within reach. The officers might be unconscious, but a call to emergency services could still bring response. What would this partnership involve? I asked, slowly sliding my hand toward the device. "Documentation of procedures, analysis of outcomes, application of your pattern recognition capabilities to research questions." He tilted his head, studying my face. "You would observe modifications rather than experience them directly, at least initially." My fingers touched the phone's edge. "And you'd stop killing. Unnecessary harvesting would cease," he acknowledged. "Your involvement would improve efficiency, reducing required specimens." I grasped the phone, simultaneously launching myself from the bed in the opposite direction. The movement was clumsy, hampered by residual effects of whatever compound he'd used, but it created momentary distance. Michael moved with inhuman speed, but I'd anticipated his direction, throwing the bedside lamp toward his face. The distraction bought precious seconds as I fumbled with the phone, activating the emergency call function. What happened next occurred too quickly for clear recollection. Michael lunged across the bed. Something sharp grazed my arm. The bedroom window shattered inward as a projectile, later identified as a flashbang grenade, arced through the opening. The explosion of light and sound disoriented both of us. I tumbled to the floor, ears ringing, vision filled with afterimages. Through the chaos, tactical officers in full gear swarmed through both window and doorway. Michael moved like liquid shadow between them, impossibly fast despite the disorientation. 3 officers went down before the others could react. Then he was through the bedroom door and down the hallway, pursued by shouted commands and the red dots of laser sights. More detonations shook the house, flashbangs deployed in sequence to disrupt his movement. Glass shattered somewhere distant. A single gunshot echoed, followed by cursing. Then silence. An officer helped me to my feet, escorting me outside where paramedics waited. As they examined the shallow cut on my arm, Sheriff Miller approached, expression grim. "He's gone," he reported. "Jumped through a second-story window and disappeared into the trees. We're tracking with infrared, but..." He shook his head. "It's like nothing I've ever seen. The speed, the strength. 2 of my men have broken bones from brief contact." "He's been modifying himself," I explained, the reality of Michael's claims finally sinking in. "Using harvested components, animal and human, to enhance his capabilities. Miller's expression shifted from skepticism to reluctant consideration. The medical examiner found surgical alterations in some of the remains, evidence of experimental procedures before death. We assumed they were performed on victims, not on himself, I finished. Each generation of his family pushing the research further. He's not just a killer, he's transforming himself into something else entirely. Dawn was breaking as emergency vehicles departed, leaving behind a perimeter of heavily armed officers surrounding my property. Miller remained, coordinating with state and federal authorities now joining the investigation. How did your team know to intervene? I asked as we watched helicopters circling overhead. The officers outside were unconscious. Not all of them, Miller explained. We've been rotating personnel with different positioning each night. One officer was stationed in a blind 30 yards into the woods specifically to watch the others. When they went down, she called for backup and maintained observation. You anticipated this? He nodded grimly. After our last conversation, I realized he wouldn't simply abandon interest in you. So we created a controlled environment, appearing vulnerable while maintaining hidden surveillance. You used me as bait, I said without rancor. We provided protection while acknowledging likely contact, he corrected diplomatically. And it worked. We've confirmed his existence, documented his capabilities, and narrowed search parameters based on his approach vector. In the growing daylight, teams of officers combed the surrounding forest, following the path of Michael's retreat. Dogs barked excitedly, picking up scent trails that crisscrossed in confusing patterns before disappearing entirely near a limestone outcropping half a mile from my property. By mid-morning, specialized units had arrived, FBI agents with experience tracking fugitives in wilderness settings, forensic anthropologists to examine recovered remains, even military consultants with expertise in subterranean structure detection. We'll find him, Miller assured me as I watched them coordinate. No one can hide forever, no matter how well prepared. But his confidence seemed hollow against the reality I'd witnessed. A being no longer fully human, possessing capabilities beyond normal limitations, with decades of family knowledge about surviving in these specific woods. That afternoon, as I packed essentials for temporary relocation to a secure facility, I received an unexpected delivery, a small package left at the edge of my property discovered during perimeter checks. Inside lay Harold Whitaker's journal along with a handwritten note. Our conversation remains pending. Observation continues from new perspectives. Your potential remains significant. The message confirmed what I already knew. Michael Harrington remained active in the surrounding forest, watching from hidden vantage points, biding his time. The woods had become his domain, the trees his allies, the shadows his pathways. As I handed the note to Miller for evidence processing, I realized a fundamental shift had occurred. I had begun as an unwitting observer, noticing strange occurrences at my property edge. Now I had become the observed, studied by something that moved between human and other, seeing me as both subject and potential collaborator. The investigation continues today. Federal authorities have established a permanent presence in the area, conducting regular sweeps with increasingly sophisticated technology. Occasional evidence of Michael's continued existence emerges. Strange animal deaths, glimpses of movement captured on long-range surveillance, the persistent sensation of being watched that visitors to the deep woods report. I've relocated permanently to a coastal city 3 states away. My woodland home sold to the government for use as a monitoring station. My security precautions have become second nature. Varied routines, regular surveillance checks, awareness of sightlines and unexpected shadows. Yet despite the distance and precautions, I sometimes wake at night to find my bedroom door slightly ajar, despite my certain memory of closing it. On those nights I lie motionless, listening to the silence, feeling observed by eyes I cannot see. The watcher remains patient and persistent, waiting for opportunity. And though miles separate us, I know with bone-deep certainty that our conversation, as he called it, remains merely postponed, not concluded. I'm from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and my story begins on a frigid Sunday in January 2021. Winter had wrapped its icy fingers around our town, leaving the landscape barren and ghostly in its grasp. The Susquehanna River flowed silently beside the trail at Chickies Rock, near the Route 30 bridge, a place familiar to locals but holding secrets I would soon wish had remained hidden. My older brother James and I had arrived around 4:30 p.m. The sun was already beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The temperature had dropped significantly since morning, and our breath hung in visible clouds before us as we trudged along the empty trail. The parking lot had been vacant except for our weathered Honda Civic, its blue paint chipped and faded from years of Pennsylvania winters. "Nobody's crazy enough to be out here today except us," James had remarked as we stepped onto the trail, our boots crunching through the thin layer of ice that had formed over yesterday's snowfall. We were looking for a quiet spot away from the main path, somewhere to smoke and talk without interruption. Our weekly hikes had become a tradition over the past year, a way to escape the confines of our small apartment and the mundane routine our lives had fallen into since the pandemic began. The woods were eerily quiet that day. No birds sang, no squirrels darted between the naked trees. Even the usual distant rumble of traffic crossing the Route 30 bridge seemed muted, as if the cold had dampened all sound. I remember pulling my scarf tighter around my neck, fighting against the wind that seemed to find every gap in my clothing. "I need to take a leak," James announced after we'd walked about half a mile. "Keep going. I'll catch up." He stepped just a few feet off the trail behind a large oak tree. I continued walking alone, my thoughts drifting as I admired the way the fading sunlight glinted off ice-encased branches. The beauty of winter had always captivated me despite its harshness. The stillness of it all felt almost sacred, like walking through a vast frozen cathedral. That's when I saw it. About 30 yards ahead, something moved on the trail. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, a shadow perhaps, or a branch swaying in the wind. But as I focused, I realized it was an animal. Not just any animal, but something I couldn't immediately identify. Its movements were unnatural, jarring in a way that made my skin crawl. The creature stood about 3 feet tall with a lean, muscular body. Its fur was a strange ashen gray, almost translucent in the fading light. The proportions were all wrong. Elongated hind legs reminiscent of a kangaroo, but with the slender frame of a greyhound. Its face was narrow, deer-like, with ears that seemed too large and alert for its body. The most disturbing aspect was its gait. It moved with an unsettling bounce, occasionally rising to stand on its hind legs before dropping back down to all fours. Each movement seemed deliberate, calculated, as if it were studying the terrain. "Or me, James," I called out, my voice cracking. "James, you need to see this." I heard my brother's footsteps rushing toward me, the crunch of snow and twigs announcing his approach. "What? What is it?" he asked, slightly out of breath as he reached my side. I pointed silently, afraid that speaking would somehow alert the creature to our presence, though I had the distinct impression it was already aware of us. "What the hell is that?" James whispered, squinting to get a better look. As if responding to his question, the creature suddenly turned its head in our direction. Even from this distance, I could feel its gaze lock onto us. My heart hammered against my ribcage as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Then it did something I still can't explain. It took a few deliberate steps in our direction, moving with that same unsettling hop-step gait. The movement was somehow both mechanical and fluid, like watching a poorly animated figure come to life. "It's coming toward us," I breathed, instinctively taking a step backward. James grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my jacket. "Don't move," he hissed, though I could feel a slight tremor in his grip. The creature paused, its head cocked to one side in an almost curious manner. For a moment we all remained frozen, two humans and this inexplicable being caught in a bizarre standoff as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the bare branches above. Then, without warning, it darted sideways off the trail and into the woods. "Did you see that?" I gasped, finally releasing the breath I'd been holding. "Yeah, I saw it," James replied, his voice unusually tight. What the hell was it? We stared into the woods where the creature had disappeared. The trees stood stark and leafless, their trunks creating a maze of vertical lines through which we should have been able to track the animal's movement. But there was nothing. No sign of movement, no rustling of undergrowth, no sound of retreat. It had simply vanished. "That's impossible," I said, moving cautiously toward the spot where it had left the trail. "We should be able to see it. There's nothing to hide behind." James followed me, his posture tense. "Maybe it's just fast." Really fast, but that explanation didn't satisfy either of us. The woods weren't dense enough to provide cover, especially in winter. The undergrowth was sparse and visibility extended at least 50 yards in every direction. Nothing that size could have disappeared so completely, so quickly. I stepped off the trail, my boots sinking into deeper snow. "I want to check," I said, though part of me screamed that this was a terrible idea. "Wait," James called, but I was already moving forward, drawn by a curiosity that overshadowed my fear. The spot where the creature had entered the woods showed clear signs of disturbance. Paw prints unlike any I'd seen before, with elongated hind impressions and smaller, more delicate foreprints, but they extended only about 10 feet into the woods before disappearing completely, as if the creature had simply evaporated or taken flight. "The tracks just stop," I called back to James, who had remained on the trail, scanning the surroundings nervously. "Come back," he urged. "The sun's almost gone. We shouldn't be out here after dark." He was right. The light was fading rapidly now, the forest transforming from muted gray to ominous black. The temperature seemed to drop with each passing minute, and a new quiet had settled over the woods, the heavy silence that comes with true wilderness after sunset. I reluctantly returned to the trail, unable to shake the feeling of being observed. "What do you think it was?" I asked as we began walking back toward the parking lot, our pace considerably quicker than before. James shook his head. "Not sure. Maybe some kind of escaped exotic pet. People keep all sorts of weird animals these days." His explanation sounded hollow, even to him, I suspect. Pennsylvania winters are harsh. An escaped tropical or desert animal wouldn't survive long in these conditions. And whatever we saw moved with too much purpose, too much familiarity with its surroundings to be an outsider. "It seemed to be watching us," I said quietly, like it knew exactly what it was doing. James didn't respond to this, but I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder as we walked, his eyes scanning the darkening woods on either side of the trail. By the time we reached the parking lot, night had fully claimed the forest. Our car sat alone in the gravel lot, its windshield already frosting over. I felt a wave of relief wash over me at the sight of it, a familiar sanctuary amid the unknown. As James unlocked the doors, I took one last look back at the trail we'd just exited. The path disappeared into darkness, swallowed by the night and the looming trees. For a split second, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the tree line, a flash of ashen gray, a pair of eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of my apartment, replaying the encounter over and over. The creature's strange movements, its unnerving gait, the way it had looked directly at us before disappearing into thin air. These images cycled through my mind on endless repeat. Around 2 a.m., I grabbed my laptop and began researching native Pennsylvania wildlife. I scrolled through pages of deer, coyotes, foxes, and bobcats, but nothing matched what we'd seen. I expanded my search to escaped zoo animals, cryptids, and urban legends associated with the Susquehanna River Valley, but found nothing conclusive. A text from James lit up my phone. "You awake?" I replied immediately, "Can't sleep, you?" "Same. Keep thinking about what we saw today." We exchanged a few more messages, both of us dancing around the fact that what we'd encountered defied explanation. Neither of us was prone to flights of fancy or superstition, yet we couldn't reconcile what we'd witnessed with any rational explanation. "Maybe we should go back tomorrow," I suggested. "In daylight. Look for tracks or signs." There was a long pause before James responded. Not sure that's a good idea. His reluctance surprised me. James had always been the adventurous one, the first to suggest exploring abandoned buildings or hiking off the marked trails. His hesitation spoke volumes about how deeply unsettled he was by our experience. The next morning, exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. Dark circles shadowed my eyes and my movements felt sluggish and disconnected. I called in sick to work, unable to face the prospect of pretending everything was normal. As I made coffee, I found myself drawn to the window of my apartment that faced west, toward Chickies Rock and the Susquehanna River. Though miles away and blocked by buildings, I stared in that direction, feeling an inexplicable pull. What was out there? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that our encounter hadn't been by chance, that somehow we had been chosen? Despite James's initial reluctance, 3 days later we found ourselves back at the Chickies Rock trailhead. It was Wednesday afternoon, my day off, and James had switched shifts at the warehouse to join me. The parking lot had a few more cars this time, a middle-aged couple preparing for a hike and a solitary photographer adjusting equipment near his truck. The presence of others provided a small comfort as we set off down the now familiar path. Daylight revealed a different forest than the one we'd fled from on Sunday evening. Sunlight filtered through the bare branches, casting intricate shadow patterns on the snow. Birds called to one another, and occasionally a squirrel would dart across our path. It all seemed so normal now, James remarked as we approached the area where we'd had our encounter. I nodded, though I couldn't shake the underlying tension that had settled in my stomach since we'd arrived. The forest felt watchful, as if the trees themselves were bearing witness to our return. We slowed as we reached the spot. It looked unremarkable in the daylight, just another stretch of the well-worn trail, bordered by leafless trees and patches of melting snow. It was right about here, I said, pointing to the area ahead where the trail curved slightly. James nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings with methodical precision. And it went off the trail there, he added, gesturing to a small gap between two oak trees. We stepped off the path and into the woods, careful to avoid disturbing any potential evidence. 3 days of intermittent snow and sunshine had erased most signs of our previous visit, but I was determined to find something, anything that would validate what we'd seen. For nearly an hour, we combed the area in widening circles looking for tracks, fur, or other signs of the creature's presence. The couple we'd seen in the parking lot passed by on the trail, nodding politely in our direction before continuing their hike. "What exactly are you boys looking for?" A voice called from the path. I turned to see the photographer we'd noticed earlier, his camera hanging from a strap around his neck. He was older than I'd first thought, perhaps in his 60s, with a weathered face and keen eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Just looking around," James replied vaguely. The man studied us for a moment, then stepped off the trail to join us. "You saw something, didn't you?" he asked quietly. The photographer's name was Howard Brenner. He'd been documenting the changing landscape around the Susquehanna for over 30 years, he told us, as we sat on a fallen log just off the main trail. "I've seen things in these woods that defy explanation," he said, his voice low despite the fact that we were alone, things that shouldn't exist, at least not according to any biology textbook. I exchanged a glance with James, whose skepticism was evident in his furrowed brow. Yet I found myself leaning forward, eager to hear more. "What did you see?" Howard asked us directly. After a moment's hesitation, I described our encounter, the strange creature with its kangaroo-like hind legs, greyhound body, and deer-like features. I mentioned its ashen gray color and the way it had moved with that unnatural hopping gait. Most importantly, I described how it had seemingly vanished into thin air, leaving no trace in a woods where concealment should have been impossible. Howard listened without interruption, nodding occasionally as if confirming details against some mental checklist. When I finished, he remained silent for a long moment, gazing out into the forest. "You're not the first," he finally said. "There have been sightings around here going back decades. Most people keep quiet about it. Who wants to be the local crackpot, right? But I've documented at least 7 separate encounters since 1996. What is it?" James asked, his skepticism giving way to genuine curiosity. Howard shook his head. I don't know. Not for certain, but I have theories. He reached into his camera bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. Flipping through the pages, he stopped and showed us a sketch, a detailed drawing of a creature remarkably similar to what we'd seen. This was drawn by a biology professor from Franklin and Marshall College in 2008, Howard explained. He was collecting specimens along the river when he had an encounter much like yours. The sketch captured the creature's unsettling proportions and strange features with disturbing accuracy. Seeing it rendered by someone else, someone who had no connection to us or our experience, sent a chill down my spine. There's more, Howard continued, turning to another page. This one contained not a sketch but a photocopy of what appeared to be an old newspaper clipping. This is from the Lancaster Intelligencer Journal, October 1879. A report from local farmers about strange creatures seen near the river after a period of unusual flooding. The archaic language of the article described gray beasts of unnatural configuration that moved with a most disturbing, leap-walking manner and disappeared as if by ethereal means when pursued. People have been seeing these things for over a century, Howard said, closing his notebook. Always near the river, always elusive, always defying classification. As Howard shared more of his research with us, the afternoon light began to wane. Winter days are short in Pennsylvania, and darkness comes quickly. I hadn't noticed the time passing, so engrossed was I in the photographer's stories and theories. We should head back, James finally said, checking his watch. It's almost 5. Howard nodded, returning his notebook to his bag. You're right. These woods aren't a place to be after dark. Not if you've seen what you've seen. We walked back toward the parking lot together, Howard occasionally pausing to photograph interesting ice formations or the particular way light filtered through the trees. Despite the unsettling nature of our conversation, I found his presence reassuring. Here was someone who believed us, who had dedicated years to documenting the very phenomenon we'd witnessed. What do you think they are? I asked as we neared the end of the trail. Not what people have called them, but what they actually are. Howard paused, considering his words carefully. I think they're watchers, he finally said. Guardians of some kind. I don't believe they're supernatural. More likely some undiscovered species that's evolved to be perfectly adapted to this specific ecosystem. Their ability to seemingly vanish? Probably some form of camouflage we don't understand yet. Nature is full of adaptations that seem impossible until they're explained. His rational approach was comforting, though it didn't entirely dispel the unease I still felt when thinking about our encounter. Will we see it again? James asked. Maybe, Howard replied, but I suspect only if it wants to be seen. We reached the parking lot as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the western hills. Howard's truck was parked next to our car, both vehicles now the only ones remaining. As we exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch, I glanced back toward the trailhead one last time. The forest beyond had been swallowed by darkness, the path disappearing into an impenetrable wall of shadow. And there, just at the edge where light gave way to darkness, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a lean, gray shape with eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Howard, I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the spot. Look. But by the time he turned, whatever I'd seen, if I'd seen anything at all, had vanished. The Watchers, Howard murmured, a note of reverence in his voice. Always watching, rarely seen. As we drove away from Chickies Rock that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were leaving something unfinished. Our encounter had opened a door to a world operating alongside our own. A world of creatures that defied conventional explanation, of mysteries hiding in plain sight. I've returned to that trail many times since, sometimes with James, sometimes with Howard, occasionally alone. I've never again seen the creature as clearly as I did that January evening. But I've caught glimpses, a flash of movement in my peripheral vision, tracks that stop abruptly in the middle of open ground, the sensation of being observed when no one else is around. Whatever lives in the woods beyond Chickies Rock, Whatever watches from the shadows along the Susquehanna remains a mystery. But I know what I saw. And I know that sometimes when I walk those trails, it sees me too.